believe, in the front row. Somebody should be in the front row.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It seems silly to stand and talk to you with such a small group, so I think I'll sit in this chair.
We could move people up toward you, too. We don't have to be all...
Well, actually, the distance is okay, given where we are in life, you know what I mean? So, to get the announcements out of the way in the first place, this is the first of two sessions. This series really belongs to Refugee 1. The more important of these two sessions will be on Tuesday, October 25. It's a Tuesday, not a Monday. 2 weeks from, well, today's a Tuesday. That's a Monday, right, Chris? Yeah, this is a Tuesday. This will be 2 weeks from yesterday, on October 25 at 7 o'clock. Sarah Spoonheim from Refugee 1. She knows everything about Refugee 1. She's wonderful, so that please return for that. I hope we have a bigger crowd for those folks. But tonight I want to talk about sort of the history of immigration in the United States and why, after 400 years, we continue to struggle with this issue between ourselves. So I got curious at the beginning. It's called Refugee 1, and I'm talking about the history of immigration in the United States since 1607, let's say. What's the difference between an immigrant and a refugee?
Be an immigrant and not fleeing persecution in your native country. A refugee is kind of fleeing something, right?
That's very good, Gail. I think that's... Anybody else have anything to add to that? So I looked it up, and there are subtle distinctions, and Gail's got it mostly right. By the way, when you start Googling the phrase, what is the difference between, the first thing that comes up, Christine, what is the difference between a Presbyterian and a Methodist? So clearly, millions of Americans are asking that question on a daily basis, and October 25, you're going to give us an answer to that question, okay? But anyway, I went on ahead and said, what's the difference between an immigrant and a refugee? And basically, Gail is our local Google here. And a refugee is any person who's been forced to flee their country because of war or persecution. An internally displaced person is a refugee that doesn't cross a border. And an immigrant, down at the bottom, an individual who willingly leaves their country of origin and settles somewhere else where they're granted permission to permanently resettle. As I think, you know, many of the immigrants to the United States in years gone by were also refugees. We'll talk about more of that in a minute. They were fleeing terrible conditions in their own homelands. But some of the immigrants who come today are solicited by us and by our corporations, right? You've heard of the Einstein visa. People who are so famous or capable or irreplaceable that we need them here in the United States. Melania Trump got one. No comment? So I wanted us to think tonight about what it means to be an American. What is an American? These are two of the first people that popped into my mind. John Deere farmer and a cowboy are quintessentially American. NCAA athletes, Wildcats and Wolverines. Both white, incidentally. Surfer boys, co-eds, Americans, African Americans in African garb. These are Americans. Think about this for a minute. Copeland, Gershwin, and Bernstein were all children of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe or from Russia. I think Bernstein was born around 1918, so his parents would have immigrated here in the early years of the last century, fleeing persecution in Russia or the Ukraine. And these three people were born here and grew up speaking English as a native tongue. The only accent you would have heard from them would be the Brooklyn or the New York accent, the Jewish Brooklyn or New York accent. But these three people wrote some of the most quintessentially American music in the 20th century. Fanfare for the Common Man, Appalachian Spring, West Side Story, and American in Paris and Rhapsody in Blue. I think that's so wonderful. The guy, and that's George Gershwin, obviously. He was born Jacob Gershowitz. These are all Americans. Tough sometimes, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that impresses you about America is the salmagundi of its citizens, just the potpourri, the mixture. I want to make a deliberately provocative hypothesis that the greatest contribution of the United States to the world after the Constitution and the Declaration, I'll place them in the same pile, and the defense of democracy in the 20th century, our greatest contribution to the world is our ability to receive any kind of person from around the world and metabolize them into our own culture. That's my hypothesis. Now, what's interesting about immigration in the United States is that it keeps getting harder and harder. Okay, so who were the first immigrants to the colonies, to the New World, besides the Native Americans? We'll talk about them in a minute. Chris. Yes, but what's the American narrative?
Those people who land on Plymouth Rock.
Yeah, and why did they come here, Bev?
They were being persecuted for their religion.
And why were they being persecuted?
It turns out that they were pretty poor congregationalists.
Yes, that's the word I'm looking for. Congregationalists. Bev says Chris said the English and the Spanish, depending on what part of this continent you came to. You know, St. Augustine was populated way back when, and the American Southwest was populated way back when by the Spanish. But the narrative we tell ourselves is about what I call English dissenting Calvinists. They were persecuted by and excluded from the mother church, the Anglican church, in their homeland. And then the next people who came were Episcopalians, and the Episcopalians did okay for themselves. They were Anglicans, actually, at the time. The Episcopalians did okay for themselves. Most of our founding fathers were Episcopalians: Washington, Jefferson, probably Monroe. Not Adams, I don't think, because he was from Massachusetts. But these quintessentially English people, these Anglo-Protestants. William Penn was a Quaker, which originates from the motherland in England. Later in the 19th century, after a long time of almost no immigration, we started receiving European Christians, mostly Northern European Christians, from Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, Northern Europe. And then we started receiving Jewish Americans. And then we started receiving Hispanic Catholics and Asian Buddhist Christians and South Asian Hindus, and lately, much to our difficulty, Muslim Americans, right? So we keep absorbing people who look more and more different from the original people. Chris?
The Southern Europeans were largely Catholic, but not all Hispanic. All the Italians, the Greeks, I mean, the people that came from that southern part of Europe.
Yes. Let me see. What's my next slide? Yes. So Chris is pointing out that people. Well, here. I'll keep going. I won't repeat what Chris said, but I'll try to, and she can correct me if I'm wrong. The first stage is colonial immigration. The Mayflower people were immigrants, right? Even if you were a daughter of the American Revolution or you came over here on the Mayflower, you are an immigrant. In fact, even if you're Native American, you're not Native American. You are descendants from people who came here from somewhere else. right? Even the Native Americans who came here in 14,000 years ago crossed a land bridge at the Bering Strait from somewhere else. Even they are the descendants of immigrants, including the Mayflower people. But half of those immigrants who came to this, what became the first 13 colonies, were indentured servants. And then, of course, slaves from Africa. The second stage, mid-19th century, Chris, I think this is what you were getting at. The Northern Europeans, the people who looked more like Anglo-Saxon and acted more like Anglo-Saxon and were Protestant. The Germans and the Dutch. The Irish weren't Protestants, but they spoke English, sort of. So, and then around the turn of the 20th century, all these South and Eastern Europeans came. The Italians, the Romanians, the Polish, the Russians, many of them Jewish because of a persecution in Eastern Europe. 1914 to 1965, there was very little immigration to the United States. And then, in fact, in the 1930s, there was a net emigration from the United States. That's Great Depression. And from 1965 to present, the predominant form of immigration to the States is from Central and South America and Mexico, and from all over Asia, including South Asia, India, and Pakistan, and so forth. It's interesting, in 1700, before the birth of the nation, there were 1 million European Americans here. I don't know how many Native Americans there were, probably another 1 million to 3 million. In 1800, the population was 5.2 million. In 1900, 75 million. In 2000, 281 million. In 2020, we have about 330 million Americans. The projection is that there will be at least 600 million and maybe 1 billion Americans by the turn of the next century. Isn't that incredible? Presently, 45 million Americans are foreign-born. About 14% of the population, which is near its peak. More about that in a moment. Approximately 11 million of those 45 million are undocumented. Peak immigration by decade. Just recently, 1991 to 2000, and 2000 to 2010, 10 million. The largest immigration in a 5-year period was 2000 to 2005, 8 million people. Half of those were undocumented. Arresting news. 7 states have majority-minority, or to put it a different way, non-Hispanic whites in 7 states are in the minority today. California, the District of Columbia, which turned majority African American years ago, a long time a minority non-Hispanic white. Hawaii has never been white majority for obvious reasons. And then Maryland, New Mexico, Nevada, and Texas all have non-Hispanic white minority populations. In 2010, 35 of the 50 largest cities have white minorities. Of the 15 biggest American cities, only Jacksonville and Columbus are still white majority. That's striking, isn't it? That means Chicago, Boston, New York, LA, Seattle, Houston, Dallas. The projection is that by 2050, the middle of the 21st century, the white population in the United States will be a white minority. Did somebody say something? I talked right over you, Elaine. Go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In 1960, in most of our lifetimes, 85% of Americans were white. Think about that. The change that's happened in our lifetimes. So this is a bit of an old statistic, but in 2010, there were 40 million foreign-born, 269 million native-born, 13% foreign-born. And this is how the foreign-born break out. This is 2009, so I haven't caught up with the 2020 census yet, so these figures are sometimes 10 years old. But you can see the immigration to the United States is predominantly Latin American, and then many from Asia as well. The original immigrants from Europe are dwarfed by these numbers. I want you to see the deep blue states, California and New York. Percentage of the state's total population is foreign-born. Notice the deep blue states, California, Hawaii, New York, New Jersey, it looks like. But then the next deepest blue is Illinois. So it looks like about 15 to 19% of Illinois' population is foreign-born. We don't think of it that way, especially downstate, right? It seems like a lily-white John Deere farmer kind of a state, doesn't it? Foreign-born population as a percent of states, again, the deep orange, the states I mentioned a minute ago, Hawaii, California, Nevada, Texas, Florida, New York, Massachusetts in this case, New Jersey. Again, Illinois is pretty dark. In the second tier, 13.7% foreign-born. You know, that's a good question. Statisticians lying, I suppose. These are states in which the population is less than 50% non-Hispanic white. Again, the deep orange are striking, and Illinois is in the second tier. The kind of beige states are less than 60% non-Hispanic white. There's a chart that shows the foreign-born population by country of origin. Mexico dwarfs everything else. China is in second place. But notice that all the way down, it's Asian countries and Central American countries. Here's some good news. The United States receives more immigrants than the rest of the world combined, and more immigrants in raw numbers than any other single nation. Although it's also true that Canada and Saudi Arabia have more foreign-born people as a percentage of their total population. Since 1986, there have been 7 amnesties for the undocumented. We argue so violently about whether, what do they call those people? Dreamers. Well, whether the dreamers should receive amnesty. It's been happened 7 times in my adulthood. I graduated from seminary in 1985. Many of them have been by Republican presidents. More Americans than not receive more in services than they pay in taxes. 60% of us receive more in services than we pay in taxes. But immigrants, as a rule, over the course of their lifetime, pay $80,000 more taxes than they receive in services. Listen to this. 47% of the PhDs, science PhDs in the United States are foreign-born. Which means the good news is the brain drain is coming our way. Radically. And we have like 9 of the top 10 universities in the world right here. And yet, all of these PhDs are coming here from other places. They probably were born in other places and come to MIT and UCLA and Cal Berkeley, right? With every successive wave of intense immigration, America manages to metabolize the newcomers into the body politic. That's why I showed you those Americans in hijabs and burqas. Somehow we're able to metabolize those folks into our midst, even though they look very different from those English-descending Calvinists who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. So far, we've been managing to figure this out. Someone put it this way: immigrants come to America wanting to be Americans. This is not true in every land. Someone else put it like this: Americans are Americans who were Americans before they got here. And Europeans are Americans who stayed home. So the people that come, this is true in every land, this is not exclusive to the United States, but the people who move and uproot their existence, leave their families, learn a new language, learn a new culture, learn new mores and standards, these are the most ambitious people in those other countries around the world, right? And the people who stayed, despite hardship, are people who are satisfied with the way things are. So immigrants bring gumption, chutzpah, with them to their new countries, not just to the United States, but wherever they go. Here's a question for the group. John and I were talking about this a minute ago. Why is America able to metabolize different kinds of folks from all over the world better than many other places? What I'm thinking of is that Queens is more ironic than London in terms of the people of color who live there. It seems to me that Paris and London struggle more with their Muslim populations than New York does, for instance. That Muslims stay Arabic or Pakistani or, I don't know, pick your place, Syrian, longer than those folks who come to this place. Would that be true? Maybe my thesis is off. But if it is true, why is it true?
I think it's less true now than it was, at least when my grandparents immigrated here, and my parents, who would be first generation Americans, all growing up, even though they grew up in communities that had lots of people from the same country, they went to school, they intermarried, and those cultures got shared and combined, and now it's more efficient.
Yes, Chris says it's less true that we're metabolizing our immigrants today than it was in her. Your parents were immigrants from where?
My grandparents,
From where?
Italy, Spain, and Yugoslavia.
Okay, those are tough places to come from, but not as tough as Syria, right? Part of it might be that we're taking in. When you come here from Vietnam, that's not like coming from Italy, right? I mean, there's something European about those places. And America is very European. America, in its origins, were never very Asian, never very Chinese.
I think one of the reasons that we do it is public schools. People are forced to go to public schools, and that's one of the places where you kind of, get to talk about what it is to be an American.
Okay, did you hear what Bev said? Bev says public schools are the reason we're able to metabolize different kinds of people. And I'm thinking, Bev, I don't know if you did this in your classrooms. The Pledge of Allegiance starts today. Did you?
But I certainly was a fervent American.
Right.
And I taught 7th and 8th graders. So
Yes.
by then they weren't standing up and doing the Pledge of Allegiance. We kind of wandered into it advisory in the morning. I was more thinking about the school that our Betty kids went to. It was an incredible school full of people in hijabs, people speaking all kinds of language, and the only white people were speaking Russian. So here was this whole public school, but that's how all those kids got together.
Bev is talking about a school where a lot of the girls are in hijabs and the white people only spoke Russian, and yet somehow these young people were becoming more and more American.
And friends.
And friends with each other, yes, yeah. Anybody have any other speculations about why we're able to do this a little better?
You can press the microphone if you want.
It was just housekeeping, Elaine. She's talking about the microphone. No, she's not contributing anything meaningful to the... Think about the French laws. You can't wear a burqa in Paris. It's against the law. And we understand why. Right? I mean, this goes against every principle of the revolution in France from the 18th century. Women, you have to cover women up because they're dangerous to men. So I get what the French do, but somehow we haven't had to make this rule yet. Maybe coming. So how do you figure that is? What's going on?
That's true of this public school I'm talking about. DeWitt Clinton Elementary School, for parent-teacher conferences, there were burqas. Sort of like, yeah. So they were all accepted. They were all coming to have a conference about their child.
Yeah.
And that's
yeah.
what was going on. It wasn't what they were wearing. It was what was going on.
Ah, yes. Bev is talking about public schools in our area where the parents come to parent-teacher conferences in burqas.
Yep.
But it doesn't matter what they were wearing. They were there to talk about their children and their children learning the American narrative, right?
Or getting in trouble, whatever.
Yeah, maybe sometimes that was the case too. So now on, I want to leave the statistics and the reality of where America has been going for 400 years and to look at our scriptural background. So you've heard the word xenophobia. That's a word that comes from the Greek xenos, which means stranger, foreigner, or alien, and the Greek word phobia, which you know as in claustrophobia, fear of the stranger. Xenophobia is fear of the stranger. And, you know, before we become too disgusted with people who fear the different and the alien and the strange, we need to remember that xenophobia is part of our evolutionary process and progress, right? In the course of the evolution of our species, it was very important for us to be tribal, to identify the other and the enemy. Homo sapiens is the naked ape. We have two defenses against the vicious outside world. We have our huge outsized brains, and we have each other. And so even, you know, you've heard this statistic that even an infant in her mother's arms, shown photographs of people, recognizes her own. She has an African-American baby has more positive responses to African-American adults in photographs than she does to white photographs. So some of this is natural and evolutionary and good and important. A nation, every group is like a cell, right? Every group has a membrane around it, demarcating what's within, what belongs, and what's outside. And these membranes can be variously porous, some more porous and some less porous, but a membrane keeps out the poisons and keeps in the virtuous substances, nourishment, and the chemicals that need to stay inside the cell. And so a national border is the same way. We need to be able to recognize what's different from us at the beginning, but then once we have figured it out, we need to be able to make that transition and say, you know what? They are not that different from us. Racial differences, skin pigment, and so forth are so minuscule in terms of what differentiates us that they are almost of no account. And Americans have been, I don't know, what would you say, what's our grade on a report card of welcoming the stranger and failing to fear the different? Maybe a B, given the fact that we've done this. But our scriptural heritage is unequivocal about what our duty is to the stranger, the alien. The book of Exodus says, do not oppress the foreigner. You know how it feels to be foreigners because you were foreigners in Egypt. This is the refrain that's going to be coming through in the Hebrew Scriptures over and over and over again. Be kind to the stranger. There are 3 classes of outcasts in the Hebrew Bible, from beginning to end. 3 classes of vulnerable people: widows, orphans, and strangers. Widows, orphans, and people who are far from home because they have no family to defend them. And this happens over and over again. God, Yahweh, says, be kind to the stranger because they're defenseless, and also because you were once strangers too. Do you remember that? It might be a cultural memory. The Jews, this happened to the Jews 3,000 years ago. But that cultural memory needs to be in the back of our minds when we see someone that's different from us. It's an interesting, ancient cartoon from the magazine Puck. You see these obviously prosperous white Americans forming a fence to prevent the entrance of a poor immigrant or refugee, and what the cartoon is trying to say is, in the past, in the background, in their Aboriginal memory, that's what they were years ago. Maybe a generation, maybe 2 generations, maybe 3 generations ago, but they came from the same stock. And so that memory needs to translate into the present. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Once again, a statement or a request, and then a reason for the statement of the request. Remember what you were. I am the Lord your God, says Yahweh. I want to tell you this story. The St. Peter's Church, now it's called St. Peter's and Our Lady of the Rosary Roman Catholic Church, is that church in Barclay in Manhattan's financial district. It's 2 blocks from the former World Trade Center. This is not the church where that got destroyed and where they took all the wounded people, but it's close to that. It was founded in 1785 when loyalty to the Pope was illegal in what was a brand new, this church is roughly coterminous with the United States of America. It's right when our Constitution was being ratified and we were ceasing to be colonies and becoming a nation. 1785, Catholicism is illegal. On Christmas Eve in 1806, the church was surrounded by angry Protestants trying to figure out why these people inside that church were conducting rituals in this papal superstition called Christmas. It was almost like the KKK, which, by the way, went to war in the American South, not just with black Americans, but also with Jewish Americans and Catholic Americans. The Ku Klux Klan organized to be opposed to papists as well as to Jews and blacks. So anyway,
that statement you just made about they were protesting to use the church, something called Christmas.
This foreign papal superstition called Christmas.
Didn't Protestant Christians have Christmas?
It was very late in coming. You know, in Calvinist, especially in Calvinist churches, they were not fans of Christmas. This is 1806. You know, the guy who created Christmas, we talked about this a year or 2 ago, the guy who created Christmas was Charles Dickens. And he didn't create Christmas until 1843 when he wrote A Christmas Carol. He was born in 1809, I think, or 1812. He was born about the time this is happening. So before him, Protestants didn't do Christmas. The Catholics did because they were unafraid of pageantry and beauty and loud music. Vivaldi, you know, they weren't afraid of all that. And so they were, Christmas Eve, 1806, these Catholics who were already disenfranchised from a Protestant America have this experience of being frightened by these Protestants. And so almost exactly 2,000 years later, or 200 years later, in 2011, when this Pakistani guy wants to turn an abandoned building 1 block from the World Trade Center into a mosque and an Islamic center, and the whole country goes crazy. 70% of Americans are opposed to what they called the Ground Zero Mosque. First of all, it wasn't at Ground Zero. It was 2 blocks away. And secondly, it wasn't a mosque. It was to be a gym and a place where Muslims could meet. And so these people, remembering what happened culturally, multi-generationally, remembered what happened to them in 1806, were the first people to say, welcome to the neighborhood. Do you remember this? This happened, I think, in 2011. So it's 10 years after 9/11, and this guy wants to put this Islamic center 2 blocks from Ground Zero, and the whole 70% of Americans were opposed to what they called the Ground Zero Mosque, but not St. Peter's Church. Because of their memory, they'd experienced this as being outsiders. If we remember that we too are outsiders, we will welcome the stranger more readily into our midst. And then Jesus picks up the same thing in the New Testament. I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. And I was a stranger and you welcomed me in. And even the epistles get into the story. And the author of the letter to the Hebrews says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. What is the author of Hebrews referring to? Elaine? No, probably not. You got a picture there. You got to cheat.
I don't know who she is, though.
Story of Abraham and Sarah, when the 3 visitors come to tell her she's pregnant. She hides behind the door and laughs.
Okay.
Abraham welcomes the strangers into his house, and it turns out they're 3 angels. And now to explain my little title, this is one of the core creeds of the Jewish faith. This text is older than the Hebrew Bible. This probably goes back to about 1000 BC. The book of Deuteronomy may have come into the canon around 600 BC. But this text, we think, is way back when. It's sort of at the core, the seed, the grain of sand, the oyster spins her pearl around. And what this text says, a wandering Aramaean was my father. He went down into Egypt. So who is the wandering Aramaean? Who went down into Egypt in Hebrew history? How did the Hebrews end up in this foreign land called Egypt?
They took that kid with them. The kid, the youngest
Cha.
kid.
Did you hear what Chris said? Bev is saying they took that kid, and I think Chris just named the kid as Joseph.
I thought it was going to be Joseph before, but I was like, I didn't know he was Aramaean.
Well, yes. It's because he came from Aram. Aram is just another word for Syria. So that's where Abraham and his son Isaac and his grandsons Jacob and Esau come from. Jacob ends up on the run because he cheats his brother out of his birthright. And then he has to go running away. And then there's a famine. He's got 12 kids, right? He's got 12 kids, and there's a famine in Palestine, but they have food in Egypt. And why do they have food in Egypt? Chris?
They were smart farmers?
Yes, but why were they smart farmers? Bev says they were smart farmers, but why were they smart farmers?
Well, before that's when the brothers tried to kill off Joseph, and these Egyptian guys came and took him, and he went in prison, but he was smart. He had these dreams.
Yeah. Did you hear what Chris says? Chris is telling, you know what one of the greatest gifts to the Christian church in the last 30 years is? I think it's Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. We know this story because that was a brilliant little piece of stagecraft. And I forget, I think it was Andrew Lloyd Webber. He does the lyrics, right? And Tim Rice does most of the music. Andrew Lloyd Webber wrote Joseph and the Coat for his 6th grade brother, so the kids could have something simple to perform in class. And then it becomes this global phenom. But the reason I love it is because you can't forget Elvis the Pharaoh. And you can't forget the 12 boys. And you can't forget Joseph and Potiphar. And that's, I bet, Chris, that's why you know this story. Or maybe you were a Star Sunday School student. I don't know. But
Oh, I do know it from the musical.
yeah. So Jacob is the wandering Aramaean. He takes his family down into Egypt. And while they're there, they become a great nation. And the Egyptians persecute them, treat them harshly, put them to work. But they cry to the Lord, and the Lord hears them. And God brings them out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power, signs and wonders, and brings them to this place flowing with milk and honey. That is the story of every American too. It might be 10 generations back. Your ancestors may have come here on the Mayflower, but they came here from somewhere else. And they came here with nothing. And Squanto threw them a party on the first Thanksgiving with some squash and some venison, and they were on their way. And that we are the inheritors of this unmerited bounty and have been given this great land. And so therefore, we should make that happen for as many people. I'm not talking for open borders. That's a dream, but a generous welcome to anybody who needs a refuge is what our scriptures call for in both their Hebrew and Christian forms. And so I'm sorry it only took 38 minutes to do this, but I'm finished with my spiel. What does anybody have any questions?
Do you want me to pass the mic, or do you want to repeat the question?
Well, I think John would like you to pass the mic, but there may not be questions. There's 2 for 7 of us in the room, and 2 of us are paid to be here, and one of them's married to somebody who's paid to be here.
If anybody has comments or
And there-
wants to have discussion, do it with this in your hand, please. Because there are 12 or 13 people on the live stream who would
Great.
love to.
Welcome, live streamers. We're glad you're here. We're lonely here. Any questions or comments or corrections? Maybe Sarah is online and she'll correct me in 2 weeks when she comes.
I will say one thing. There's a new group starting, right, that hopes to host a refugee family?
Yes. Thank you, Kathy. I think I'm going to leave that to Sarah
Okay.
because I don't know exactly. Kathy said there's a new group starting. We've done 3 families since I've been here, which I'm very proud of. And there's a group that's interested in doing a 4th sponsorship of refugee family. That process has been dormant. One of the groups, Bev, when did you do your group?
When do we do it, Chris?
We did it in 2017, and so really we were involved from June of 2017 until December of 2018. But we chose to be involved for a longer period of time because they had 9 kids and they just needed more support. So we continued to tutor and that through that time.
Yeah, and so then, a lot of that activity dried up. Refugee One, I think, has been fairly dormant with new arrivals since 2017. But they're gearing up again. So, and Kathy, as long as you've got them, go ahead, Chris. I was gonna change the subject.
I have a question. So I know where the Catholic Church stands in terms of its view on treatment of refugees, treatment of immigrants. Where do some of the big Protestant churches stand on this issue, particularly on the evangelical side? Because it seems to me very counter to what you hear in Scripture based on how populations that claim to be evangelical Christians sort of behave.
That's a great question, Chris. It's very complicated. First of all, you're right in pointing out that the Mother Church has a virtuous record of standing for the stranger and the alien, and for fairly open borders, especially under Pope Francis. That would be a signature of his moral stance. The evangelical church is a little bit complicated. So let me say something that's a little bit stereotypical. Well, let me say something positive and negative about the evangelical churches. The mainline churches, by the way, have been allies to strangers and aliens. Fairly open immigration policies. The Methodists, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians stand along with the Catholics. The evangelical churches have no platforms. They don't make national pronouncements on anything except abortion. But what happens in the evangelical church is they are Jesus-centric. They love Jesus, sometimes to a fault. And many of them pick up, Jesus, I was a stranger and you invited me in. They pick that up and are generous with the stranger and the alien. However, here's the negative thing I want to say, and it's a bit stereotypical, but it's been very clear in the last 4 years that the evangelical church is a refuge for the white supremacist. A lot of them take hiding behind that sanctity in the evangelical church, and it comes out sideways. It really does. You know, that's, I mean, somebody challenged me on that, but any person of color is like a bull seeing red for a lot of those folk. Elaine?
I have a question that I would love to hear from all of you on why you think that there are so many immigrants that come to this country and live here for many, many years, but stay within their own communities, never learn the language. I'm not passing judgment on this. I'm curious about it, why they stay in their own groups and never learn the language and never really come, full circle into the country they've moved to. I just have always kind of wondered about that.
She asked the group. Who has an answer for her?
I could just say one thing because of the experience we had with our own family. I think it's very hard to learn a new language. And so the parents in our family have a lot of difficulty using English. And they're more comfortable with people that are like them. So they do find the Syrian community or whatever. The kids, on the other hand, we have to have the kids there to be our translators now because they've gotten the language down and they're assimilating into their new. I think it's just really, really hard. I don't know. Does anybody else think the same?
I agree, totally.
Is
Yeah.
part of it
The
because
parents, it's so hard.
is it
Yeah.
But the kids want to be with their friends.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Yeah.
but isn't English a really hard language to Okay.
And she would say to me, I'll learn English when you learn Arabic. And they tried to teach. There would be no way that if I got plunked down in Syria and I had to learn Arabic that I could
Right,
do it. You couldn't do it, Bill. You know that. And you know Greek and Hebrew.
I was younger then.
Plus, on top of that, people that come here, particularly as refugees, have a pretty short window to get employment because there's only so much support. I think it's like 3 or 4 months of their rent being paid. So they need to get a job, and they're often in jobs that don't require English, and they're often in sort of factories that are dealing with food production and that. And so they don't really, they're not in an environment where they're sort of forced to, but they're working long hours, so they don't really have all the hours to then come and study. So it is complicated, and I think that it's more important that they can feed their family than to force themselves to try to learn English, a lot of it on their own.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I agree that learning a language is hard. I actually lived overseas for 2 years and tried very hard to learn the language, had a lot of time to study, and I found myself, crying at the bank because I just couldn't, I'm I consider myself a very intelligent person. So languages are hard, I think. And then the second thing I would say, Elaine, your question about, sort of stretching outside of your community. And I wonder how much of that is, part of who we are as non-immigrants too. I think particularly in Chicago and maybe in America in general, it's hard to make cross-cultural friendships. I don't know that we do that very well. Maybe someone else has a perspective on that, but.
Thank you for sharing that personal experience, Christine. Kathy, you wanted to make an announcement too. We'll wrap it up with Kathy's announcement.
And this doesn't have anything to do with refugees.
Right.
So we'll end that discussion. But on November 7, Bill and I are hosting a trip to Chicago Shakespeare Theater to see As You Like It. And it's going to be a really, I think, cool production because it's using music by the Beatles mixed with Shakespeare. And so we're going to do a lunch. It's a Sunday afternoon matinee. We're going to do a lunch at KUC first with a short discussion and talk about what we're going to see, and then tickets to the matinee. So my email is in the church directory, so if you're interested, we still have 7 or 8 tickets available, and would love to have people come. So thanks.
Thank you, Kathy. And then I'll close us with this benediction. I forget where I obtained this. I don't think I wrote it myself. But it goes like this. May the children of the stock of Abraham, read Jews, Christians, and Muslims. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. Amen. Thank you for being here, guys.
Thank you.
To your point, Elaine, it was my great grandparents that came over, both sides.